You share the same bed, you share the same table, you eat the same food, breathe the same air, sleep under the same roof night after night, year after year. And yet, if someone asked you to describe the last real conversation you had with the person beside you, not about bills, not about the children, not about what to have for dinner, not about something that needed to get done, you would go quiet, because you cannot remember. That silence is not emptiness. It is a sound. It is the sound of two people who have slowly, carefully, and visibly moved to opposite ends of the same house without ever opening a door. That is the question at the center of today's story. Not whether two people love each other, but whether two people who live together are actually still present to one another, or whether they have become two separate souls sharing the same address, like strangers in a boarding house who have simply stopped noticing the door between them. St. Teresa of Avila looked directly at this question, not from a comfortable distance, not from a convent where such things were only theory, from inside the experience itself. She spent nearly 20 years of her life inside this exact condition, present in body, absent in spirit, going through the motions of closeness with a skill that no one around her could detect, and what she eventually discovered about the mechanics of that separation, about what it costs a soul to remain inside it, and about what it actually takes to come back, is something that will change the way you understand every relationship you have ever had. If you value this kind of deep historical and spiritual research, subscribe right now. It is the best way to support this work. And comment from which city you are hearing this. This script draws directly from Teresa's own writings, primarily the book of her life, written between 1560 and 1565, under instruction from her confessor, the manuscript of which is held in the archive collections linked to El Escorial near Madrid and the interior castle, composed in 1577 in Toledo under direct orders from Geronimo Gracian, her principal confessor and collaborator in the Carmelite reform. These are not secondhand summaries. These are primary sources written by a woman who lived what she described and whose work was reviewed line by line by the Spanish Inquisition itself before being accepted as doctrinally sound and theologically reliable. Now back to the information. Teresa de Cepeda y Ahumada was born on the 28th of March, 1515 in Avila, a walled city in the central Castilian plateau, sitting at roughly 1,100 meters above sea level. Cold winters, thin air, massive granite walls built in the 11th century. Her father, Alonso Sanchez de Cepeda, was a man of converso background. His family had Jewish roots and had converted to Christianity, a fact that carried enormous social anxiety in 16th century Spain, where blood purity was a legal and social category. And the strain of that hidden identity shaped the household. Alonso was rigid about virtue. He was strict about appearances. He ran a house where the external presentation of goodness was not optional. Teresa inherited his intelligence and his social awareness, and she used both very differently than he intended. She entered the Monastery of the Incarnation in Avila on the 2nd of November, 1535, at the age of 20. The Monastery of the Incarnation was not a place of severe enclosure. It had approximately 180 nuns, which was already far more than the building was designed to hold, and the culture inside was more like a small city than a cloister. Nuns received visitors in the parlor. They maintained long social relationships with people outside the walls. They ate differently depending on their social class. Teresa, by her own account, was exceptionally good at parlor life. She was charming, witty, and attentive. People wanted to spend time with her. She wanted to spend time with people. And every hour in the parlor was an hour not spent in the silence she increasingly found uncomfortable. She attended the required vocal prayers every day. She fulfilled every ritual obligation. She received the sacraments. But she was not, in any interior sense, praying. She was performing prayer. And the difference between those two things, a distinction that Teresa would spend the rest of her life explaining with extraordinary precision, is the difference between being in a marriage and being in a contract. Here's what most people do not understand about Teresa's teaching. When she talks about prayer, she is not talking about ritual. She's not talking about words recited in the correct order, at the correct hour, in the correct posture. She is talking about something that maps almost exactly onto the problem of two people who live together and have begun to drift. She defines mental prayer in chapter 8 of the book of her life with a single sentence that theologians and spiritual writers have been quoting for over 460 years. She calls it nothing else than an intimate sharing between friends, taking time frequently to be alone with the one who we know loves us. That is her entire definition, not a formula, not a technique, not a method of friendship. And the central requirement of a friendship, the thing that makes it real rather than merely functional, is time and presence and honest attention. Her point, and this is the point that cuts, is that you can be physically in the room with someone for years, saying the right words, performing the right gestures, fulfilling every external requirement of the relationship, and be completely, catastrophically absent. Not absent because you hate them, not absent because you have chosen someone else, Absent because presence is harder than performance. Because real presence requires vulnerability. Because vulnerability requires that you show up with what you actually feel rather than what is easiest to show. And she knew this because she did the opposite for 19 years. From 1535, when she entered the Monastery of the Incarnation, until approximately 1554, Teresa of Avila was a practicing nun who had essentially stopped practicing interiority. She was good at the outside. The inside had gone quiet in a way that she describes in the Book of Her Life, Chapter 7, with a level of precision that is almost clinical. She says the trouble began not with sin, not with a catastrophic failure. It began with conversations. Harmless, pleasant, easy conversations in the parlor with people she enjoyed. And every hour spent there was an hour not spent in the kind of quiet attention that deepens a relationship. First, she shortened her time in interior prayer. Then she rearranged it to a more convenient time. Then she stopped altogether, for stretches that lasted months at a time. She did not stop because she hated it. She stopped because it had become uncomfortable. It was like trying to have an honest conversation with someone she had been slowly ignoring. The silence on the other end of that silence felt like accusation. That feeling, that particular discomfort of returning to someone you have been avoiding, is something that anyone who has been in a long relationship recognizes immediately. You stop talking about something important. Days pass, then weeks. Then the topic becomes so loaded with unspoken weight that raising it feels dangerous, so you do not raise it. You become fluent in the language of the surroundable. You get very skilled at talking about everything except the thing that matters. And the longer you do it, the more that unspoken thing grows in the background, and the more energy it takes to keep pretending it is not there. Teresa recognized this architecture with perfect clarity. She describes it in the Book of Her Life, not as a moral failing, but as a structural process. A drift, a cooling, a gradual habituation to less. Here is what she identified as the engine of the drift. It is not dramatic. It is not a betrayal. It is not a crisis. It is something much quieter and therefore much more dangerous. It is what she calls spiritual aridity, dryness, which arrives not as punishment, but as a natural consequence of divided attention. When you stop bringing your real self to an encounter, when you show up in body but scatter your attention everywhere else, when you answer questions without initiating anything, when you perform closeness without risking it, the warmth that was once there begins to cool. And the cooling is so gradual, so unhurried, so polite, that you do not notice it is happening. Until one day you sit down in the same room where you once felt everything and you feel nothing at all. The room has not changed. You have changed. The distance has been building inside you the entire time. That is not the end. Teresa says very clearly, and this is important, it is not the end. But here is the part that people miss. She says the most dangerous moment is not when the coldness arrives. It is what you do next. Because there are two responses to discovering you have drifted from someone you care about. The first response is to return, to sit down inside the discomfort, to stop pretending the warmth is still there when it is not, to be honest about how long you have been away, and to begin again from exactly where you actually are, not from where you wish you were. The second response is to leave the attempt entirely, to tell yourself it is too late, too broken, too distant, too much work, to walk back to the outer rooms, to busy yourself with the functional, to settle into the good enough and call it fine. Teresa chose the second response for 19 years. She writes that she stopped mental prayer almost completely during a stretch she estimates at roughly a year, possibly longer. The exact period is difficult to pin to a single month, but scholars working from the internal chronology of the Book of Her Life, including Kieran Kavanagh and Otilio Rodriguez, in their 1976 critical translation published under the Classics of Western Spirituality series through Paulist Press, placed the most severe period of her inner abandonment somewhere in the early 1540s, when Teresa was in her late 20s. She was not unhappy in the way that produces crisis. She was unhappy in the way that produces numbness. She was functional. She was pleasant to people. She fulfilled her duties. She remained liked and valued inside her community. And she was, by her own account, dying inside in a way that no one around her could see. What she was experiencing in her spiritual life was structurally identical to what happens in a human marriage when two people stop being honest with each other. Not dishonest in the crude sense of lying about facts, dishonest in the deeper, more costly sense of performing closeness without risking it. Two people can live together for a decade and never once say what they actually feel. They can be polite and functional and even kind and generous. They can laugh at the same things and share the same bed and face the same direction every morning, and be living in a kind of interior exile that neither of them can fully name. Because to name it would be to admit how long it has been going on, and that admission is more frightening than the silence. Teresa named it. She called it the beginning of a very great evil. not because the drift itself is irreversible, but because of what the drift produces inside the person who accepts it as permanent. A slow habituation to absence, a training of the soul to expect nothing, to offer nothing, to survive on appearances. And once you have trained yourself to live in that way, once the performed closeness has become more automatic than the real kind, the distance stops feeling like a problem. It starts to feel like safety. It starts to feel like the natural order of things. She writes in chapter 8 of the book of her life that she would tell anyone in this condition one thing and one thing only. Do not stop. Do not leave the room. Even if the prayer is empty, even if you feel nothing, even if you come to the encounter dry and cold and ashamed of how long you have been absent, come anyway, because the damage is never in the distance. The damage is in the decision to make the distance final. Now here is where Teresa's understanding of love and union becomes specific in a way that most people do not expect. Because she's not just asking for willpower. She's not saying try harder or feel more or do better. She's pointing to something structural inside the soul, inside any pair of souls that are in genuine relationship, that changes when two people stop sharing their inner lives. And the image she uses for this in the interior castle, written in Toledo in 1577, is one of the most exact images in all of Western literature on the interior life. She describes the union of two souls bound together in love using the image of two wax candles pressed at the tip so closely that there is but one light. Not two lights side by side that merely appear close. One light. One flame coming from two sources. And then she says something that most people reading the text move past too quickly. She says the candles can be separated again. The wax can be divided. The wick can be pulled back. They do not stop being candles when they separate, but they stop being one light. That image is not merely about mystical union between a soul and God. That image is a precise description of what happens in any intimate relationship over time. Two people come together. They share enough of themselves, enough of their time and attention and honesty and presence, that something new comes into being between them, a shared warmth that is genuinely more than the sum of two separate people. And they can lose that, not in a single catastrophic act, not from a single lie or fight or betrayal, by the slow, daily, almost invisible practice of withholding, of showing up in body and quietly withdrawing in spirit, of answering when spoken to and never initiating, of being technically present and functionally gone. Teresa spent 19 years as one of those separated candles. She was inside the monastery of the Incarnation. She said the prayers. She attended the masses. She lived in community. And the flame between her and the relationship she was supposed to be living had gone out. Not in a single moment, not on a single day anyone could point to, but by thousands of small withdrawals, each one so minor it seemed to mean nothing, each one accumulated over years until they meant everything. The recovery, when it came, was not gradual. It was sudden and it was violent in its gentleness. In 1554, Teresa was 39 years old, 19 years into her religious life. She walked into a corridor in the convent and found a statue, a figure of the wounded Christ, damaged and bleeding, that had been borrowed for a feast day celebration and left temporarily in a passage. She knelt down in front of it, and something inside her that had been held at careful distance for nearly 2 decades broke open. She described it in the book of her life, chapter 9, as a moment she could not have manufactured or planned. She said she fell to the ground. She said she begged Christ to strengthen her once and for all. She described it as her conversion, not her conversion to Christianity. She had been Christian her entire life, a nun for 19 years, a daily receiver of the sacraments, but her conversion to honesty, her conversion to presence. She stopped pretending she was in a relationship she had stopped tending. She stopped making the appearance of being there substitute for the reality of being there, and she began again. What happened in the years that followed was documented with painstaking detail in the interior castle, composed between June 2nd and November 29th of 1577, a period of less than 6 months. She was managing the organizational chaos of her Carmelite reform at the same time, dealing with a hostile papal nuncio named Felipe Sega, who was actively working to dismantle everything she had built, and suffering from headaches she described as nearly unbearable. She was in her early 60s, in pain, under institutional pressure from Rome and from within her own order. She wrote The Interior Castle in those conditions, and a Toledo nun who served as the first of 4 copyists was transcribing it as Teresa wrote, departing for Avila before Teresa had reached the 2nd chapter of the 5th mansion, which gives us a concrete measure of both the writing pace and the interruption. The final manuscript was completed by 3 other nuns and preserved and carried forward by the Carmelite communities Teresa had founded across Spain. The interior castle describes the soul as a crystal castle with 7 concentric rooms, 7 mansions, each one closer to the center where a great light lives. The outermost rooms are full of reptiles and noise and distraction. She is not being merely poetic about the reptiles. She means the things that occupy your attention when you're not being intentional about what you let in, the anxieties, the comparisons, the small grievances, the daily performances of being fine, the things you think about instead of actually attending to the person in front of you. And the innermost mansion, the seventh, the center, is where the two candles become one flame. That is the destination. That is what is possible between two people who choose, consistently and at cost to their comfort, to keep moving toward each other. The path from the outside to the inside is not a path of extraordinary experiences. It is not a path of mystical gifts or dramatic moments of clarity, though those may come for some. It is a path of attention, of choosing again and again to bring your real self to the encounter rather than the managed version of yourself that needs nothing and risks nothing. Here's the part that lands hardest. Teresa says that most people who begin the interior journey stop in the third mansion. They achieve what she calls the exemplary life. They are good people, virtuous, reliable, charitable toward others, diligent in their duties. They offend no one. They help where they can. And they are completely, stubbornly, almost permanently stuck. Not because of a major sin, not because of a catastrophic failure, because of a subtle and deeply human preference for safety. They have gotten close enough to real intimacy to feel its warmth, but not so close that they risk the complete exposure it requires. And they make their home there, in the almost, in the functional, in the satisfactory. The third mansion of Teresa's castle is where most long-term relationships eventually live. Two people who have built a life together, who care for each other, who are not enemies and not unfaithful, and who show up reliably, but who have quietly, mutually, and almost without deciding to, agreed to stay in the outer rooms, to be housemates rather than lovers in the fullest sense, to be cooperative rather than genuinely honest, to be present in body and carefully, thoroughly managed in soul. And Teresa says that is not peace. That is a negotiated truce, and a truce is not a marriage. The deepest insight she offers, the one that cuts through everything else, is this. The drift between two people does not happen because they stop loving each other. It happens because they stop being honest with each other in the places where honesty costs something. Because honesty requires vulnerability. Because vulnerability requires that you bring what you actually feel, rather than what is easy to manage. And over time, the managed version of yourself becomes the only version the other person sees. You become readable, predictable, safe. And safe means no surprises. And no surprises means no discovery. And no discovery means two people sitting across the same table every night for 30 years and running out of things to say before they are 50. You cannot become one flame with someone you are hiding from. You cannot have union with someone you're managing. The warmth between two people, the single light that comes from two candles pressed together, can only exist when both people are genuinely there, not strategically there, not there in the way that protects their dignity or preserves their comfort, there in the way that risks something. Teresa knew this because she had done the opposite for 19 years. She had been thoroughly absent while performing presence every single day, and the cost of that, she wrote in the book of her life, was an interior poverty so complete she could not even measure it while she was inside it. You do not know how empty a room has become while you are standing in it. You only understand it when you finally walk out and look back through the window and see the shape of all the years that passed in there without anything real. She also understood something that almost no one else writing on this topic has managed to capture with equal precision. She understood that the moment you decide to return, the moment you genuinely try to close the distance rather than continue maintaining it, is the most painful moment of the entire process. Not the drift itself, not the numbness, the return. Because the return means admitting how long you were away. It means sitting down with the discomfort of someone you have been not quite present to for years and being honest about that without a good excuse. It means being exposed in a way you have been carefully avoiding. And the temptation in that moment is enormous. To get up, to find something that needs doing, to remind yourself that plenty of people live this way and seem okay, to tell yourself the distance is manageable and the life you have built is enough. Teresa's instruction for that moment is the hardest thing she wrote, and she wrote it in multiple forms across 3 separate books. Stay. Do not move. Do not leave the room. Not because it will feel good immediately. It will not. The dryness and the discomfort are real. The awkwardness of trying to be genuinely present with someone who thought they already knew the managed version of you is real. The shame of how long the distance has been there is real. But the act of staying, of choosing to be present when presence costs you the safety of your distance, is the only act that can reverse the drift. It is the only thing that can relight the candle. She uses the image of a garden 4 full times in the book of her life to describe the soul that is attempting to return to genuine inner life after years of dryness. A garden that needs water. And she outlines 4 ways of providing that water, each one requiring progressively less direct human effort and more receptivity as the person advances. The first way is drawing water by hand from a well. You lower a bucket, you pull it up, you carry it to the plants. Slow, exhausting. Producing only a little water at great cost. visible results only after a very long patience. This is the experience at the beginning of return, the beginning of rebuilding real presence after years of managed distance. It is not graceful. It is not quick. It is bucket after bucket after bucket, day after day, with very little visible reward and no guarantee that it will look better next week. She does not promise it will feel good quickly. She promises it is worth it and that it works. The second way of watering is a water wheel, a mechanism that lifts more water with less direct effort. This corresponds to what happens after sustained honesty over time, a kind of ease and presence that was not available at the start, a loosening of the old habit of managing. The third way is a stream directed through the garden by channels. The fourth way is rain, the relationship no longer requiring the laborious bucket work because something genuine has shifted in the way two people inhabit the same space. Not because the difficulty disappeared, because both people stopped flinching from it. Most people quit when the bucket is heavy. They look at how much work is required to rebuild genuine closeness after years of drift, and they make a quiet calculation that the cost is higher than what they think they can afford right now. They tell themselves there are children to manage and jobs to keep, and other people have marriages like this too, and nobody is complaining publicly. They go back to the third mansion. They settle into the functional. They fall asleep in the same bed and look at the ceiling and try to remember the last time the person beside them said something that genuinely surprised them. Teresa would say, you cannot afford that choice. Not because the relationship will end. It may not end for another 20 or 30 years. It may continue with every external indicator of success, warm and polite and quietly airless, but because of what choosing the outer rooms permanently does to your own soul over time. The soul that habitually performs presence without genuinely offering it does not stay unchanged. It contracts. It grows familiar with less and less as the years pass. It begins to believe that the functional is the ceiling of what is possible. It stops expecting warmth. It stops risking honesty. And eventually, without quite deciding to, it forgets that it ever knew how to be fully in a room with another person. Forgets what that felt like. Forgets what it cost and what it gave. And that forgetting, that is the real loss. Not the other person, not the relationship. You. This is what Teresa called the greatest danger of the third mansion. Not that you are lost, not that the relationship is broken, but that you might spend the entire remaining portion of your life convinced you have already arrived. She was 52 years old when she began the interior castle in 1577, and she had 32 years of active religious life behind her, 19 of drift, 13 of recovery and advance, and every year of that advance purchased by the daily decision to stay in the room when leaving would have been easier. The book she wrote in those 6 months in Toledo, produced in conditions of physical pain and institutional chaos, is one of the most serene books in the history of Western spirituality. Not because Teresa had reached a place beyond difficulty, but because it is honest. Because it was written by someone who knew the full cost of absence, who had measured it with nearly 20 years of her life, and who had chosen to pay the full cost of return anyway, one bucket at a time. There is a question embedded in the first pages of The Interior Castle that most readers pass without stopping. Teresa asks whether you actually know what lies at the center of your own soul, because most people, she says, spend their entire lives in the outer rooms. They manage the exterior beautifully. They handle every duty. They perform every required role competently and even admirably, and they never walk toward the center. Not because the center is locked against them, because walking toward it requires passing through rooms that are uncomfortable, rooms where the noise of your own avoidance becomes audible, rooms where you meet what you have been carrying, rooms where you cannot maintain the performance of being fine. And she says, the warmth lives at the center. The single flame lives at the center. And every step you take away from the center, every honest moment you defer, every real feeling you manage rather than share, every time you answer with what is expected rather than what is true, is a step away from the only place where another person can actually find you. You can be married for 40 years and never be found. She knew this. She had lived it. And she wrote it down in a small cell in Toledo at the end of her life, in a book she did not expect to outlast her. The Interior Castle has been in continuous print since 1588, 6 years after Teresa's death on the 4th of October, 1582, in Alba de Tormes, a town in Salamanca province where she died at age 67, returning from founding yet another convent. Pope Paul VI formally recognized the scope of what she had produced on September 27, 1970, naming Teresa of Avila Doctor of the Church, the first woman in the history of the Catholic Church to receive that title. The recognition came 388 years after her death. The manuscript she had produced under protest, convinced it had little value without rereading it between sessions, is still the most exact account available in any language of what happens when two souls share space without sharing presence, and what it costs and what it takes to come back. When scholars undertook the critical edition of the Book of Her Life in the 1960s, the Kavanaugh Rodriguez edition for the Institute of Carmelite Studies, They noted something in the original autograph that does not appear in most translations or summaries. The passages in which Teresa describes her 19 years of dryness and interior absence contain the highest density of crossed-out phrases in the entire manuscript. She wrote something, then she crossed it out, then she wrote it again more precisely. The description of her own drift, her account of how she had spent nearly 2 decades in the rooms without being fully in the rooms, she could not get down to her own satisfaction on a single pass. She had to cross it out and try again. There's a kind of shame in precision. As anyone who has ever tried to give an honest account of a long silence knows, the woman who wrote that she had spent nearly 20 years in a beautiful place, present in every outward way, and was nowhere to be found, she crossed out that description and wrote it again, more carefully, more completely, not because the theology required it, because the honesty required it, because the entire architecture of what she was building, the castle, the candles, the rain, and the river, depended on her not flinching from the full truth of what the alternative had been. 2 candles, 1 flame, and the moment you withdraw the wick, the room goes darker. But the candle is still there, still holding its shape, still capable of being lit, still exactly where it was the moment you walked away. She just needed someone to stop leaving the room long enough to notice it was still there. Now, subscribe if you have not yet. This kind of research takes real time to do properly, and it is the best way to support this work. Comment from which city you're watching. And one more thing that deserves to be said clearly before we finish, because it changes the shape of everything we have covered. Teresa of Avila did not write the interior castle as a diagnosis. She wrote it as a map made by someone who had been lost in the outer rooms for 19 years, found her way toward the center at 39, spent the next 28 years building an interior life that could survive the worst institutional opposition Spain's 16th century had to offer, including the imprisonment of her closest collaborator and friend, John of the Cross, in a Toledo prison cell in December of 1577, the same year she finished the interior castle, a man she had worked beside for a decade, a poet and mystic who wrote The Dark Night of the Soul while confined alone in a room that was less than 2 meters wide, and emerged from all of that with a book so precise in its description of interior life that it is still in use in modern psychology, cited in contemporary therapeutic literature on intimacy avoidance and emotional disengagement. Not because it was written for that purpose, because what Teresa described about the mechanics of drift and return inside the soul is the mechanics of drift and return in every close relationship that has ever existed. The Interior Castle is not a book about God in the way people expect. It is a book about the self, about what it is like to have a center, a genuine interior, and to spend years living anywhere but there, about the cost of performing presence to avoid the risk of real presence, about what happens when 2 beings who are capable of genuine union choose instead to occupy the same space without ever occupying the same moment together. 18 years after her death, in 1594 and again in 1615, the Church undertook formal processes of beatification and canonization that required testimonies from people who had known Teresa personally. More than 300 witnesses gave accounts. The testimonies are preserved in archival collections held at the Vatican and in Salamanca. Among the details that recur across dozens of independent accounts is one that is easy to overlook. The witnesses repeatedly described Teresa not as extraordinary, not as unusually gifted or unusually holy in some visible way. They described her as fully present, as someone who, when she was with you, was entirely with you, who listened in a way that made the person she was listening to feel that nothing else existed in that moment, who brought the whole of herself to every encounter, who was not in any way managing the experience. That quality did not come naturally to her. She had to build it. She had to build it after 19 years of doing the opposite. She had to learn at 39 to stop performing presence and start risking it. And the path from one to the other was not graceful. It was a bucket and a well and a garden and a long patience and a decision made again every single morning to stay in the room. The candles are still there. They are still capable of being lit. The question is only whether you are willing to stop walking out of the room.